Hello folks, Gary Garrett's here. This is one of a series of videos I produced showing how to approach design and mixing color elements in plein air landscape painting. I'm bringing up the reference photo I'll be using, but remember, I'm changing many things in it to fit my sense of design, composition, point of view, and focus. I always advise walking around your subject first before you start to sit down and actually paint or draw. That way what you can do is you'll be able to create your own sense of design and use the elements of what you see in different viewpoints to be able to create a more dynamic composition. So generally when I lay out a drawing, what I do is I think more of the shape design and block things out in a very angular way. That way I can see the relationship and the composition as a whole instead of seeing everything as objects and textures, which will get in the way of starting out the painting, because the composition will be one of the most primary efforts in making the viewer sort of buy into what you're painting. So I sped the drawing up about 3 times normal, just again so you can see the quick relationship between all of the different elements in the drawing. And you might note that I'm already like pushing trees closer together, making up palm trees, making something smaller, some more towards the horizon line. In general, I'm building a better composition rather than just copying what I see. The reason I chose a desert environment for this is that the shapes are much more harsh and have harder edges to them and higher contrast in the painting much of the time. But you also have to play that off some of the softer elements like pond fronds, desert flowers, and in general, even the color and tone of the gravel and sand on the ground. So this drawing is a lot more detailed, and the lines are a lot harder than I usually make one of these sketches leading up to the painting. It's again so you'll be able to see the whole design in context with everything else, and you'll be able to see the shape design of the different plants in relationship to one another. When starting the painting process, I start with a safe, loose wash of gradient blues for the skies, and then create a base of orange and cerulean blue mixtures tilting towards a warm temperature for the ground. Then while it's still wet, I'll take a little bit of blue and mix that in and make a little bit more of a juicy neutral gray, and then tilt that back into it, and then change the makeup of the ground plane so your eye sort of flows through it a little bit more, but the temperature of the ground moves and changes. And then what I'll do is I'll mix a little bit of green in with that, and that still has a little bit of that blue, so what you're getting is kind of a seamless kind of flow between one color and the other. So hopefully I'm getting good color shifts from warm to cool temperatures, but my value scale is staying pretty much on point. So then there will be more of a really nice kind of smooth underpainting that I'll be able to go over the top of it later. Perhaps you'll notice that I am using more of a watercolors approach here and doing a lot of wet on wet mixing and floating in those warm colors over the cool ones, making little accents here and there. But I am in control of the colors and where I am doing with them, what I'm attempting to do with them. So there's very little in my mind happy accidents. It is a very focused approach as I do this part of the painting. Here I add a little bit more water to the mixture, and even though it's bathed in light, I know in the atmospheric perspective that I want to make sure that it drops into the background, that little piece of hill back behind those trees that I'll put in later. At this point I'm going to add a little bit more punch to the composition and bring up the contrast with a more saturated idea of those stones. And you can see that I'm just sort of following my design rather than the photograph. And then also the angularity of the texture goes up against the softness of the ground plane. I choose to jump into the upper part of the composition to start working on that sycamore tree. And once again, you'll notice that I'm definitely saturating the foliage up there because I know I'll be coming over it with darker areas later. But I want to make sure that it bends towards the light rather than trying to copy off of my reference materials that you can see to the lower left. When I mix these darks, what I'm doing is I'm using sort of that first yellow-green that I put down, mixing in some ultramarine blue with that, and then coming even in with some raw sienna to kind of warm up the under part of the foliage as it is getting the bounce light off the ground. I want to get this dense foliage underneath these trees in the background, so I make a mixture of Windsor green and alizarin crimson, maybe a little bit of flame red in there. It's not black, there's no black mixed in there, and you can see a little bit of changes in there. And again, I'm trying to build up the rhythm of the shape design of the shadows underneath the trees. And you can see it move across the horizon line basically, and then silhouette the forms in the foreground. You might even notice that shadow pattern shifts from a brownish green on the right hand side to a blue as it moves over to the left. Again, there's a continuity there, but it keeps the viewer kind of looking through and seeing the changes that you put into it, rather than it being a uniform shadow all the way across. Okay, so at this point I'm going to punch in these big, solid, sort of shaggy palm trees that I've laid in there. I had a big pool of that sky color left over on my palette, so what I did is I mixed in some cadmium orange with it to complement, and so I get this nice sense of warm underbrush that I'll exploit later in the painting. Having blocked in those palm trees and giving it a little bit of time to rest in my brain and figure out what to do next, I'm going to move into the foreground elements with these like really important shapes that are really going to define the character of this section of the composition. Since I want this to be a focal point of the painting, I'm really going to accent the contrast in value and color and shape. But having said that, I'm going to use a lighter tone in my value structure first to look at the general harmonizing of the entire area first before I start jumping into the, say, darker colors or the more textured parts of the yucca and the cactus that are there. So basically it's an underpainting, but what I'm doing is I can't possibly paint everything that's there clearly because it would be confusing. So what I have to do is I have to go back in and design it and do a lot of editing to make sure that eventually it'll help the entire composition rather than just painting a bunch of useless facts. So if you've seen some of my previous videos, you'll notice that on my palette I mix up really large pools of color. And so what I did is I used that yucca color in the lower left hand part, went up, used some cadmium yellow to sweeten it up a little bit, and now I'm going into the palm fronds. That way again I can harmonize and unify the entire painting, yet at the same time change the brush strokes and the shape design of the palm fronds that I'm putting in there. The overall rhythm and general movement throughout the composition is getting more complete. So I'm going to come in here and use this yellow-green, really super saturated, then mix a little bit more red into it. It'll knock the saturation level down a little bit and sort of push those barrel cactus into the background. This is where the observation comes in, because if you look at the photograph, the barrel cactus are really pretty neutral, but in person they've got a lot of personality to them, and the colors are really quite bright on the inside of it, and then I'm going to be putting the textures over the top of it as I go. So I built up a bit of confidence in what I'm doing here, so now I'm going to be accenting more of the overlapping shapes and the sort of attitude between all these different plants in this lower corner that will bring more of this composition into the foreground. Now perhaps you can see I got a better idea of those forms I'm painting. So now I'm going to be using the negative space and cutting into that yucca plant to accent the more spiky quality, and then pull that background behind the palm trees to punch those into the foreground more. So now to lay in that shadow shape colors, what I'm going to do is be mixing that yellow-green, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and a raw sienna in there to give it a warm bounce off the ground. Then I'll be bringing in a thinner wash of aluminum crimson with a little bit of orange and playing off the complements of those bright greens that are right next to it. It'll make them look both more vibrant. And I'll take the same color that I'm using for the cactus and actually lay in the shadow color off those volcanic stones in the foreground. I'm using that glazing technique of using the same color for the cactus on the stones, knowing that it's going to change the color of the stones, and then I won't be wasting any paint and still be building up the rhythm of the entire painting. So I make up this blue-green mixture for this pipe cactus in the background. And you'll notice after I get done getting that laid in, I'll take the exact same color that's now diluted and has a little bit more water into it and going up to the palm fronds that appears darker since it's over a lighter paint base. Perhaps you'll notice that when I'm using the brush, I don't use it in a uniform way. A lot of times I'll use the tip of the brush, the flat end of the brush. Sometimes I'll take it and flip it up so it becomes a solid, and then I get a little dry brush effect on it as I move up through the different parts of the painting. That way when I'm out in the field and having to paint very quickly, I don't have to change brushes. I can use the same brush and get many different effects out of it. I did change over to a fan brush here again because I want to get a more feathered approach to these pond fronds. It just makes the job easier sometimes. But I'm using the same technique, then I move back to the flat brush again. The brush holds more pigment in it and I can play up that shadow pattern on the left side of the tree more. Here again is where that artistic license comes in. If you look at the photograph, the palm trees look really dark, and I don't want that effect. So I'm going to go in and make them much warmer and make them a lot lighter, sort of filled with a lot more light than they actually are. So it matches my bigger sense of design rather than just copying a photograph. To me, it gives me a much better sense of place and time and even the weather as a personal memory as opposed to just replicating what I saw when I pushed a button on the edge of a camera. This is also where you make use of artists that have gone before you. I knew I was going to go out and painting palm trees and using that as my reference, so I referenced a lot of John Singer Sargent and Winslow Homer to borrow their ideas, which ultimately makes my job a lot easier. Now that I got the underpainting sort of laid in for the palm trees, I'm going to start to work into that skirt of the tree. And I'm using a combination of linear stuff with a dagger brush and dry brush technique, but I also have to pay attention to the fact that if you look at the photograph, it's really super busy and there's a lot of texture. And I have to communicate the bigger picture of the light over the top of the tree rather than worrying about all those little futzy details, which will get in the way ultimately. So I'm using more of a cool palette, painting over the top with some of the warm shadows coming off the bounce light on the ground to fill in the details, but leaving that center section rather undisturbed. So again, you see the bigger form and mass of the tree. The viewer's brain will generally put together the abstractness and the realness of the palm tree together and communicate that it is a palm tree. You don't have to go overboard with it, and as we pull back to it, you can still see that that's the surface of the whole composition as opposed to just identifying it as being a certain kind of palm tree. Ultimately, I try to see how all the objects in a composition feed into the bigger picture to make a more successful painting rather than just trying to texturalize every little thing that's in the composition, which is distracting. Okay, I think I'll just shut up here and paint a little while and kind of help pull the thing together. Now moving into a little bit more specific stuff. If you notice those two palm trees I made up in the back, that most of the strokes are a little bit more on the diagonal side because I want to give the idea that there's a little bit more wind moving through the pond fronds and then pushing them from the left to the right. Now I'm getting into the sycamore tree, but I'm not really concerned that people know it's a sycamore tree. What I'm doing is again trying to pull up more of the personality of it. Large, medium, and small strokes, dark and light, silhouetting some of the darker leaves over the blue sky in the background. I'll even be adding some blue sky holes to the tree, and even readying myself for the idea that later on in the painting I'll be putting sort of the bones and the trunks and the branches on. As I move back to this yucca plant, you'll see the shadow pattern that I'm going to start to paint here and the paint mixing that's going on. So though it may look predominantly green, I know there's a warm bounce coming off the ground and mixing with that paint. So you'll see that I pulled in perhaps some of that sap green and have the orange on the side of it, so that what I'm doing is I'm using those complements and thick and thin line, even a little bounce underneath those thinner areas, and then clustering the shadows so they don't end up being individual like little strokes, which would ruin the unity of seeing the entire plant and the objects around it. To achieve the shadow color, I'm mixing the alizarin crimson in with the Windsor green. It makes for a really nice dark. But at the same time, I have to understand my limitations and a lot of the mistakes that I've made in previous paintings. So I have a tendency to use a little bit too much line, and I have to kind of make sure that I don't lose the entire plant into those like thin streams of shadow underneath those leaves. Same goes for that barrel cactus, but boy, it's really easy to get seduced by all those little striations that are there. So I have to be very careful about making sure that I unify it by the time I get done. And chances are that means I take a wider brush at the end of the painting and sweep horizontally across the bottom of it to play up the more bounce light and shadow shape that's there. Same goes in painting these little cactus here in the back, that the lines and a little bit of that sort of deeper red moves your eye around the form rather than getting caught up in the texture, but suggesting it all at the same time. Okay, so now this is where I'm going to jump on time of day. So I'm taking this alizarin crimson with a little bit of ultramarine blue, mixing it up, and accenting those shadow shapes. You'll notice the shadows are not very long, so that suggests hopefully the idea that the sun is more over the top of the viewer as opposed to being late afternoon or early morning. Hopefully you might also notice I'm using the same mixture for everything. It's just the weight that I'm putting on the brush and the amount of mixture and how quickly I'm moving the brush across things that tells you the sort of definition of that shadow color and how it defines the volume of those stones. Okay, now if we remember back to the first part of the demonstration, I put in this like really loose sort of understructure for the ground, and I mentioned how much of it was going to be lost by the time we hit the end painting. And now you can see it, that I'm actually changing the ground colors and values a little bit to help tie the rhythm of the entire piece together, and even adding some things like new cactus, which are round shapes against the angular, adding the light strips on the top, getting a little bit more of the texture in on the side. You can see the opaqueness of the gouache really starting to work over the top of the underpainting that I put in. But though I am losing a lot of it in the later part of the painting, it gave me a really good, literally ground to put all the objects on top of and understand the three-dimensionality of what I'm trying to paint. In the last parts of the painting here, what I'm trying to do is I'm walking that fine line, that tightrope between too much detail and hitting individual plants, and then giving the idea of more of the light differences and the value differences between them, and then hopefully marching your eye back from the cactus in the foreground to the pipe cactus in the background, and then playing those lights up against the darks and getting sort of a serrated edge and showing those textural differences that's going to hopefully make the composition more dynamic. By the way, I'm not really even mixing up new colors off my palette at this point. I'm just using the ones that are there. So those blues are literally the sky colors that I mixed at the beginning of the painting. And those dark greens are coming from the sycamore foliage that I mixed before, mixed in with the red from the volcanic rock that are in another separate pool, and then even pulling in some of those purples that I used for the shadow colors on the cactus. A lot of times I find some of the best colors are supposedly those dirty, mushy grays that always wind up, that they tell you not to use. Sometimes I find those to be some of the most useful to help tie the entire composition together. So if you look really closely, you'll be able to see those really light, subtle puzzle piece shapes that I put in at the beginning, and how they perform sort of a backdrop, so I can put the texture of the grasses or the plants in front of them and be able to put flowers on top of those. And even pull that same color just really slightly back into the barrel cactuses to be able to get the form that's there and the erratic quality, but still be able to get sort of the rhythm so your eye moves across from those, say, straight or stabby lines into the background by decreasing the size of the strokes. So the eye perhaps will put those together and move your eye into the background with suggestive perspective. Okay, so I think I've got everything kind of set up, so this is where I'm going to pull the trigger on pulling in the textures and the lighting differences on the foreground to make it more of a focal point. Now, my personal problem-solving device would be to use those lines, those shadows back underneath the leaves, but I know I can't do that because if I do, the whole plant's going to fall apart, the foreground's going to fall apart. You'll just notice that yucca plant. And so what I have to do is use the contrast of the objects behind it and in front of it and pull that up along with the texture even of the individual needles on some of the yucca plants to pull your eye into other parts of the composition. It's easy to fixate on these details, but you also have to make sure that you kind of have to pull your vision backwards and always see the main composition and then see how all of that information feeds into the bigger picture, the bigger statement of what you're trying to paint. On a personal note, I always have to kind of laugh at myself because I know what kind of controlled panic's going on in my head as I'm doing this, as I'm making all of these split-second decisions about color and light and design. The texture, you can see I'm trying to put those needles in or hint at the edge of the leaves, and then realizing that as I'm putting that in, is I have to constantly move my eye around it and keep the composition cohesive. So that shadow shape and the color underneath those leaves takes precedent over everything else, and the line drops into the background. And then I take the same process and move it into those like larger yucca leaves in the foreground, increasing the strength of the strokes and getting the dry brush to get more of a texture that'll hopefully force your eye more towards the foreground. Now we return to the idea of direct observation. You'll see that when I put in these yucca leaves here, I'll be putting purples and greens into it, and that comes from when I actually photographed the site and did my sketches. I paid attention to the lighting the way that it was, and even the coloration that you may not see in the photograph, but it shows up when your own eyes are looking at the scene. And it makes for much more dynamic painting rather than just repeating a bunch of the same greens throughout the composition. And then you can also see that the leaves are pointing in different directions, so you'll have overlapping leaves sort of jamming up against one another and creating more of a dynamic shift in the space in that little area to the left. I'm getting very close to the end of the painting, and what I generally do at the end is I pull out that very opaque white paint and go over the top of it. You can see I'm reinforcing the needles on those yucca plants. I'm pulling in the darks underneath some of the shadowed areas there, and again, remember, it's not black, that's mixed darks, coming in and accenting things and pulling in the palm tree trunks, and then going over the sycamore tree, and finally coming in there and laying in the branches and the trunk of the tree. And if you look at the reference photo, you'll see that I didn't even see the trunk of the tree, but I still created it anyways because it created a much more dynamic composition where the tree actually is rooted in the ground as opposed to just hovering in the air. So this part in the drawing painting that's a little bit on the dangerous side, because you'll start putting in all these little details. In fact, I don't think of it so much as details as information, and just enough in there where you keep the viewer's interest to go to the background, but not enough that it becomes a distraction. Okay, here's the reference of the painting before I pull the painter's tape off of it for a clean edge. And you can see the comparison between the two. And notice how much of the original I kept and how much of it I changed. And here's a finished piece all by itself. So before we end this video and you look over this, I added some other plein air paintings that I've done throughout some travels all over the place. And you can take a look at them, whether it's out in the Mojave Desert, out in the middle of Utah, Joshua Tree. There's various little ideas of watercolor painting and gouache within these. You can see the shape design, the cast shadows that are laid over the top of areas. Different gardens, different areas out in desert areas in the middle of Kenya that I've painted. Local gardens. You can see the blue casts on the trees, the idea of the stormy weather and how that affects your color saturations. But most of all, I want to thank everybody for looking at this video, and there's other ones. Here's my contact information, and feel free to go through the other videos that I've done. There's a lot of information in them. Like them, and please add a comment if you feel need to. I'd like that. And thank you very much again for watching the videos, and adios, folks. See you later. Bye.